Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Every year, the federal government spends billions supporting research at universities across the country. That investment helps drive scientific advances, but it also depends on a complex system of funding decisions, academic institutions, and researchers. For a closer look at how that system works, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with Darren Lipomi, professor of chemical engineering at the University of Rochester and author of a new book, Science Nonfiction, Behind the Scenes in University Research.
In your estimation, what made you want to take a look at the actual funding and everything else that goes along with how the federal budget impacts university research?
I've been in the academic science industrial complex, if you will, for my whole professional life and life as a student. I've been at places that are in the news, like Harvard, where I did my PhD, Stanford, where I did my postdoctoral research, and I have been a professor and a university administrator at both UC San Diego and University of Rochester. And when your field is in the news, as it tends to be these days, you want to add to the conversation. You hear a lot of things that maybe are not so correct or that are misrepresented. And what I want to do is give the public and policymakers an idea of what happens behind the curtain in university research, and maybe some antidotes to some misinformation that might be out there, and really also to expound upon the success story that is American science and innovation, and the part of the process that your audience plays a role in, which is the super important aspect of selecting and projects and administering funding.
I'm not going to ask you to open the whole curtain because obviously we would not want you to recite your whole book. But if you could give us just a little peek behind that curtain, what actually are some of the main drivers of what gets selected, what studies get selected for funding and grants, and how does that hierarchy of what's more important, what subjects are more akin to maybe is it for getting more attention or is it for actually trying to make big discoveries? What's at play here?
For the last 81 years since World War II, the federal funding of U.S. basic science has been responsible for about half of all economic growth in America. And it is notoriously difficult to predict ahead of time what projects are going to lead to discoveries that transform human health, energy, the environment, information technology. But it is sort of the role of the agencies that steward public funding to identify broad areas, to develop programs to which professors such as myself and my colleagues apply for funding, and then assemble groups of experts to review those topics or to review those proposals. So the success rate in applying for federal funding is about 5 to 15%, depending on the program. And those programs range from all manner of basic science topics covered by the National Science Foundation to health and biomedical sciences covered by the National Institutes of Health to defense technologies covered by the Department of Defense, Department of War, and their sub-agencies as well. I don't want to forget NASA and DOE as well, covering aeronautics and space as well as energy. And so what we try to do is develop a new physical or biological effect, discover a new effect that's going to hopefully in 5 to 15 years affect human life and well-being and economic health of the United States.
So $60 billion going in annual federal research funding. Let's be honest, you're a scientist, so you get this funding. All of a sudden, you turn into a money manager, and you're having to delve into the finance side of science, which may not, some scientists may not necessarily have the experience there. Where does the funding go? Say you are successful in getting that funding. How do you delegate where that money should go, whether it is towards materials, but also paying the folks who are doing the research?
That's a great question. So the median National Science Foundation grant is about $300,000 spread over 3 years. So that's easy $100K per year. And right off the top, you have to pay for the people that do the work. And so that is the stipend. Sometimes there's tuition involved in the student training and the fringe benefits like the health insurance that a graduate student worker needs. So maybe that cost in total is $55,000 or so. Then you take another $15,000 for materials and supplies. Sometimes the professor who doesn't get paid for work done in the summer otherwise, because usually they're not teaching, they get a few weeks of summer salary. And then so that adds up to $70K or so. And then the remainder goes toward keeping the lights on, keeping the air conditioning and heating working, keeping the staff who do the financial administration, keeping them paid, paying for equipment in the lab that's not specific to that project, like air compressors, like minus 80-degree freezers, shared facilities. We call that indirect costs or overhead, and it's calculated on the basis of the direct costs that go to personnel, support, and materials that are specific to that project. And that's how you get 100K. There's not a lot of flexibility within that basic budget structure. Most goes toward personnel.
We're speaking with Darren Lipomi. He is a professor of chemical engineering at the University of Rochester. I don't want to speak for you, but I imagine a lot of the motivation for this book came from the increased scrutiny that federal funding for research has been under over the past few decade or so. You can pick out any number of Congress persons who have been on the floor citing a study that, of course, out of context sounds like a ridiculous waste of money, but when you actually dig down into it, okay, they were actually looking for ways to lower blood pressure in humans or something like that. Do I have that correct? Have you yourself felt that scrutiny when applying for federal grants?
Sure. So science has always had its cultural adversaries. Religious objections go back to the time of Galileo and before. And then you have academic relativists who treat science as just a way of knowing. I think the scientific method is much deeper than that. It's quite dissimilar to political philosophy and religion. But what's genuinely unprecedented is that the chaos in many cases is now coming from inside the government that funds the research, and that's kind of a different category of problem. So in 2019, I received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers from the Trump White House. And that's the highest honor the federal government gives early career researchers. And the work was on biocompatible materials for implantable medical devices. And then a few years later, my work was flagged by a Senate committee as being woke or Marxist because we had language in there about involving students in research who are not, from low-income backgrounds, who are not normally involved in research, kind of widen the umbrella of the talent pool from which we can draw for science. And so this all happened under the same administration, same research, but completely the opposite treatment. And it looks less like policy and more like incoherence, frankly.
Gotcha. All right. So it wasn't involving the sexual tendencies of seahorses or anything like that. It was just a regular run-of-the-mill study that got flagged.
No, but to defend my colleagues who may work in areas that may not exactly be the sexual tendencies of seahorses, but in work that could similarly be described in kind of a comical way, you never know what's going to arise from basic research. So GLP-1 medication, CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing, this all came from stuff that you could find a line in the scientific paper or the patent that said how this work was derived, and you could always make it sound ridiculous. The issue is that we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater just because there are a few lines taken out of context from a particular grant proposal.
Gotcha. All right. So, if you were involved with the decision making from the federal side, or just, if you're a professor who's trying to get federal grant money, how do we strike that balance of ensuring that the money is being spent towards nominal research? But again, you said it's research, so you're not going to know until you try, right? So that's why it's so difficult. What measures can be put in place to maybe at least make an attempt at a balance there?
One of the major benefits of publicly funded research is that even the projects that don't work out the way the investigators believed they would are still training students, not as a byproduct, but as one of the most fruitful creators of human capital that we've devised. So that's $60 billion. A good chunk of that is, at least half of that by my calculation earlier, goes toward increasing the knowledge base in the American workforce, because those PhD students, those master students in highly technical fields, oftentimes they're, like engineering research, like chemistry research, is a combination of both trades and crafts, as well as theoretical knowledge. Those people are going on and doing awesome things in U.S. industry predominantly, and also academia and policy. And even if the research aim doesn't turn into the next GLP-1 agonist drug, you still get all of that human capital on the cheap.
So give you some free PR. There is no unsuccessful experiment in your eyes.
That is true, yes.
Darren Lipomi is a professor of chemical engineering at the University of Rochester. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eric. It was a pleasure.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.